The power structure we live in, syndicates of capital, where groups of really rich people who own a lot of resources and capital leverage that to exert their power on the world and other people and accumulate more. This really started happening thanks to, I'm going to point to one family. And it might not be the family you're thinking of. It's the Dulles family. And I'm not going to talk about John Foster Allen Dulles at the beginning here. We're going to start with their grandfather, who was the first Secretary of State of the United States to overthrow a foreign government. So the airport in D.C. is called the Dulles Airport. It's their international airport, which is really fitting because the Dulles family hung out in D.C. quite a bit, we'll find, and also exerted a lot of force across the world. As Stephen Kinzer put it, the Dulles brothers set in motion many of the processes that shape today's world. So, as the globe was being divided into spheres of economic influence by imperialists and monopoly capitalists, the Dulles brothers really are responsible for following in their grandfather's footsteps and establishing methods within the state for syndicates of capital to exert control and sort of use the state and the military and the intelligence apparatus like a puppet to achieve whatever their desired ends were. So, let's get into it. Baby's first coup. Our countries are much more than we tell ourselves about them. The story that we hear about the United States of America is that it was a country founded on freedom. Freedom from the colonial rule and the tyranny of the British king, of course. But the real history is a little bit different. And the story that we'll start with is the annexation of Hawaii. And you might be thinking, but Hawaii is a state. Hawaii is not a colony to the U.S. It actually is the first colony we took. And you might hear this story of, the Hawaiians are fundamentally American. They assimilate to our culture. So, yeah, this happened during the early expansion of the states, but it is all a part of westward expansion. It is not. It's fundamentally different than what we saw on the mainland. And our political debate at that point in history was very different than, the land taking we were doing and displacing natives and genociding them to expand in North America. This was really the first time we genuinely overthrew a foreign government, is when we annexed Hawaii. And so this episode is really the moment in American history when these men had to search within themselves how they could be the leaders who established this nation of freedom on the fundamental principle of the right to self-govern if they were to do so on foreign lands. How do we square that great hypocrisy? And as Stephen Kinzer puts it, it's two things that exist simultaneously in the American mind. Americans are stubborn. We will condemn faraway rulers up until the point that we become one, and then we will continue condemning those tyrannous bastards. And that's exactly what we did in the case of Hawaii and the episodes of intervention that followed. But all of this really dates back to John Watson Foster, who was the grandfather of Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, the two brothers that ran the CIA and became the Secretary of State under Eisenhower during a lot of the prolific coups that we still point to today and say, look at how evil of an imperial nation the U.S. is. But the history is a lot deeper with his grandfather. So he was a lawyer in the Midwest, living in a small town, and he got into the newspaper business, and he used the newspapers to publish stories about how Republican candidates were good for the country. Editing a newspaper in Indiana was a politically important project because he had this influence in a swing state over elections. So when the presidential election came around in 1888, his work helped determine the outcome. Benjamin Harris was elected as a Republican on a platform of high tariffs and rejuvenating the Republican Party. He lost the popular vote, but won the Electoral College and became president. Political campaigns become administrations, and so Benjamin Harrison made John Watson Foster, this lawyer from Indiana, the Secretary of State. But keep in mind, at this point in history, this was not the post that it is now, where you're determining foreign policy for the greatest military in the world. At this point in time, America was young. This was like meeting with foreign governments, and it was almost ceremonial, like represent the country well to foreign leaders when you have tea and dinner with them. It was one of those decisions that was just routine, like a thank you for getting him elected. So Benjamin Harrison's appointment of John Watson Foster was one of those decisions that seemed sound and procedural, but it would go on to change the history of our country and the world for the worse. And so just a few years after John Watson Foster became Secretary of State, they overthrew the government in Hawaii in 1893. Leading up to that coup, newspapers around the United States started fomenting this discontent with the state of Hawaiian civilization, using the same rhetoric that had been used to make an excuse for the genocide of natives, that they are uncivilized, they don't have a god, they're not Christians. And so if Watson Foster's work in Indiana taught him anything at all, it was the power of the media, the power of newspapers to spread a narrative, to achieve political goals. That's how he ended up as Secretary of State. That's how he saw Benjamin Harrison win. And he won with the votes of two states, New York and Indiana. So that's how popular his work with the newspapers, or important his work with the newspapers was. And he was apparently convinced, in the case of Hawaii, of the propaganda he was promoting. So he wasn't so much of this like really calculated Machiavellian figure as he was kind of a capable idiot. He once wrote of Hawaii, "The native inhabitants had proved themselves incapable of maintaining a respectable and responsible government." And this was the premise of taking Hawaii, was this guy, John Watson Foster, who's a lawyer, came into a country with the strategy of, they have no written legal system. And he says, well, we're just going to make one up. We're going to go to Hawaii, and we're going to write them a constitution. They call this the bayonet constitution, a constitution enforced literally by bayonet. And then they determined that the Queen of Hawaii was acting unconstitutionally. They just made it up. They made up laws and then insisted they would be followed. That's it. That's really like the fundamental power over other people, right? Is to invent rules and laws and norms and enforce them violently. In a way, that's what government is. This has been said before, it's not original to me, but this was sort of novel for John Watson Foster. There was no such thing as international law. He was making up the rules as he went. This became his brand and defined how syndicates of capital will exert their power in time to come. So the monarchy in Hawaii needed to be replaced. A man who was American named Sanford Dole became president. His cousin, Edmund Pearson Dole, came in as the Attorney General. Sanford's other cousin, James Dole, came in and ran the fruit company there. It was originally called the Hawaiian Pineapple Company. It is now called Dole Food Company. This was not a scenario where the politics and morals of the past differ from today. This was a huge political scandal. And Grover Cleveland, who became the next president, sort of ran on this being. And this wasn't the only thing he ran on, but he did talk about how this was a ridiculous action for them to take. And he condemned John Watson Foster's continued involvement in Hawaii. Granddaddy Dulles stayed in Washington a long time. Despite his time as Secretary of State being pretty short, he decided to take it upon himself, illegitimately, to go on essentially a diplomatic trip to Hawaii. And this guy is not someone who snuck into D.C., right? He came into the White House with the door held open. And I guess those doors would be replaced by what we've called revolving doors of nefarious figures in the private sector coming in and out of public office and running the country. And soon they'll be replaced by AI-powered biometric access doors. That's what's happening. So, anyway, he goes to Hawaii, and he wrote about this in his diplomatic memoirs. He said, "While I had no mission from any authority whatever respecting the annexation of the islands, I welcomed the opportunity to visit them and to study upon the ground the question of annexation, which I regarded as vital to our country, and which could not be decided permanently in the negative without great peril to our interests in the Pacific Ocean. It seemed apparent to me that if the islands did not soon become American territory, they would inevitably pass under the control of Great Britain or Japan." The same excuses that are used today are from a playbook written by John Watson Foster, that we have to do this, or else it will threaten America, our most essential interests. And if we don't do it, someone else will. So we might as well. President Cleveland called Watson Foster's coup in Hawaii a perversion of our national mission. Now, when he, John Watson Foster, returned to Washington after this trip, he delivered what he called the most influential speech of his career on March 26, 1897. And it was his remarks and making the case for the annexation of Hawaii. Soon after this speech, pro-annexation groups printed out copies, and multiple editions were created. 10,000 copies were distributed of this speech, making the case to annex Hawaii. He told two, I think, key lies in this speech. One, it is today virtually an American colony. The paramount influence is American. And two, to my mind, annexation presents no political or administrative difficulties. The island should be admitted, not as a state, but as a part of the territory of the United States to be organized in such manner as Congress in its wisdom may determine. Convincing people in the United States realities of a land they'll never see, people who speak a different language, who live such a different life they don't even have written laws, they practice a different religion, a different daily schedule. Culturally couldn't be more different from Americans, but Americans would never know that, living so far away. They couldn't even conceive that this place was like real. You might as well be talking about going to the moon, which is what one member of Congress at the time said. But this was done on the grounds of commerce explicitly. It wasn't just a moral appeal of we have to save these people from a barbaric, uncivilized way of life. He also talked about capitalism pretty explicitly. He said, "As a rule, I do not believe in the extension of our territory beyond our present ocean limits. I think we should develop within our domain a great English-speaking nation, controlled by the principles marked out for us by the fathers of the Republic. But it is precisely because I want to see a great and powerful nation, much greater and more powerful than the one we now have, developed on this continent, that I hail the opportunity now offered in securing this outpost of our Pacific frontier, and thus protecting, for all time, our future mighty commerce and rapidly growing interests on the coast from the encroachments of the great powers striving for ascendancy in that quarter of the globe." After his speech, this became a political debate that engulfed our nation. You could argue this is the last really good political debate we ever had, because every debate afterwards would be, I guess, tainted by its outcome. We know what happened, but it was a really good debate. And so it exemplified all of the same moral arguments we hear today against imperialism. There's nothing we could say today that was not said during this time of debating Hawaii's annexation in over months and years, involving prolific figures like Theodore Roosevelt and Mark Twain, who were sort of sworn enemies, Twain being an anti-imperialist and Roosevelt being one of the most vocal imperialists in history. The thing about this debate is that it wasn't fair. The anti-imperialists did not have this 5-year head start that the imperialists enjoyed, constantly running press and papers and making the case for annexation. So when it came time that they could respond, the public had been absorbing 5 years of propaganda. But deliberations officially began July 15th, 1898. And there were speeches heard at the halls of Congress. And then there was a meeting in Faneuil Hall in Boston of other prolific figures speaking out about whether or not America should take foreign lands abroad and become an imperial nation. And the speeches were so good. One of them was by John F. Fitzgerald, grandfather to John, Edward, and Robert. And it wasn't just about the Hawaii Annexation Treaty precisely. It was about this great moral question of, is it okay for a country to do this, especially one founded on the principle that we should be free from British tyranny. So, this is how Granddaddy Fitzgerald put it in Washington that day. My colleague emphasized the pleasure that he felt in voting for annexation because of the fact that the islands had been redeemed from savagery by the devotion of American missionaries. In thinking over the matter, I've come to the conclusion that the native Hawaiians' view of the Almighty and justice might be a little bit shaken when he sees these men who pretend to be examples of Christianity and honor take possession of these islands by force, destroy the government that has existed for years, and set up a sovereignty for themselves. Now, it was Speaker of the House Thomas Reed who said that the U.S. might as well annex the moon. Reed was not in attendance for the deliberations on the 15th of July, 1898. He was sick. Either it was because he was genuinely sick, or he could not imagine being the guy who bangs his gavel, taking the first blow in what would be an era of brutally violent imperialism at the hands of the United States government. And so he would be Speaker of the House overseeing this whole process, and so he did not show up to work that day. The imperialist arguments were emotionless, aside from occasional appeals to pathos in a strategic sort of way. And no one better encapsulated this approach than Edward Ridgely of Kansas. He said, "We do not, nor do I believe we will, enter into a conquest of force, but, to the contrary, our higher civilization will be carried across the Pacific by the white and peaceful wings of our rapidly increasing commerce." A representative from Kentucky, Albert Berry, insisted that intervention wasn't an intrusion so much as the Hawaiians required it. Instead of coming up with something new, he kind of recycled the same logic we heard during westward expansion. He said when Americans sent missionaries there for the purpose of civilizing the natives, they found them in an almost barbarous condition and set to work to bring about a condition of civilization. William Alden Smith, who was a representative from Michigan, put it a little bit more bluntly and plainly. He said, "The United States is a great manufacturing nation. Eventually, we must find new markets for our energy and enterprise." One of the most interesting parts of this is, obviously, to me, the anti-imperialist arguments are far more compelling and eloquent, but the way that Twain and Roosevelt formed what Stephen Kinzer called two key poles at the opposite sides of this debate that lasted 120 years and engulfed our nation, I see Roosevelt's strength as action. He just got things done. He just went out and decided to violently, pursue, whether it was his work in the military or hunting or his own travels or his work officially in the U.S. government, to take lands abroad and brutalize indigenous people across the globe. Whereas Twain was just thinking and carefully writing about how bad this was. And maybe that's the crisis of the world itself, is that the people, the humans that care deeply, spend so much time thinking and not enough time taking action. And the people that are truly brutal and evil and spreading this violence, they're only taking action. They're not spending a lot of time thinking. And so, what if Mark Twain was a man of action? What would the world be? It just makes me wonder. But, in any case, Roosevelt and Twain actually knew of each other and hated each other. On one occasion, Roosevelt said he would like to skin Mark Twain alive. And Mark Twain said of Roosevelt that he's undoubtedly the most formidable disaster that has befallen the country since the Civil War, and that he is clearly insane. So, those are our boys. The Democratic senators decided to oppose annexation on constitutional grounds, and they were working to prevent any sort of vote on the subject of annexation, which John Watson Foster called a delay and an obstruction. The imperialist camp decided to bring about annexation by something called joint resolution. This was a legal move that the evidence suggests points to it being John Watson Foster, Granddaddy Dulles' idea. I will add that joint resolutions are meant for urgent or temporary matters for national security, war, or emergencies. And so John Watson Foster admits in his memoirs that this is repugnant because of its evasion of the constitutional provision, and it creates a bad precedent. His excuse for proceeding with this anyway was simple. It was felt that the exigencies of war justified this extreme measure, and he shared no details as to the source of those exigencies. Why did he believe war would be imminent if they didn't go and take Hawaii and annex it as territory of the United States? And this is what they do today. They say, we're going on and taking this act of violence and securing these resources and disrupting commerce in this country and taking this land and taking an act of war in order to prevent war. This excuse really dates back to, I mean, you could argue early, colonial powers, right? But in the U.S., this became a part of our foreign policy as a nation, thanks to John Watson Foster. And maybe wartime is only good for getting things done. You can't get done during peacetime. I think that's how these guys see it. And the legislative maneuver worked, and John Watson Foster was pleased. He wrote, "We were greatly relieved that upon the passage of the joint resolutions, they received a vote of 2/3 of both houses, which practically met the constitutional requirement as to treaties." And so John Watson Foster has this novel application of the law, where if no laws exist, he invents them or bends them to suit his needs. And I hear a lot of people talk about Trump like, oh my gosh, how could he do this? As if this hasn't been happening in the United States for centuries. But this new talent that John Watson Foster has makes him incredibly useful to multinational corporations, which were this new sort of thing. So if you were, let's say, a banana company that was buying up or just taking farmland in Guatemala, someone like John Watson Foster who can come in and say, let's actually just go work with the government and write some laws and say that this is why we legally own this land and why we shouldn't pay any taxes, and then we can extract the bananas and exploit the local labor. Boom. Yeah, we're based in the U.S., but we own most of the land in Guatemala that's arable, and we're going to grow bananas really cheap and sell them and make a killing. That is what a lot of multinational corporations were doing at this point in history. And John Watson Foster became kind of the first practicing lawyer for multinational corporations. And so you gotta respect the guy. He understood what laws truly are, just rules that belong to whoever is willing to make them up and enforce them. In a sense, John Watson Foster was a lawyer with no laws or borders. He made up the rules as he went. And there's no real concept of international laws that might govern a corporation beyond its borders at the turn of the century or the turn of the millennium. And so he went on to apply this all over the world. If a foreign land had no legal system, he would invent the necessary laws or rules to suit the needs of the multinational corporation. This made him a lot of money, and it got him a lot of power. And this anecdote I found from him summarizes his approach pretty well. He said, "I was engaged with Mr. Elihu Root and other attorneys in arranging the terms of transfer of a railroad concession in China. Some preliminary consultation had taken place, but a meeting was fixed for a definite settlement of the only remaining question in dispute, the price to be paid. The Chinese minister accompanied me, and we soon reached an agreement. As we came away, the minister, who was a young man and little experienced in financial matters, impressed with the celerity of our action, half soliloquizing, said, $7 million in 5 minutes? So he really saw beyond the parochial interests of most lawyers in Indiana. He imagined an entire legal world beyond the box built by statesmen. And so that's his legacy. As the country was grappling with the aftermath of the annexation of Hawaii, they were playing with tools antiquated by machines of John Watson Foster's imagination. Sure, you can try to say, how could this happen? This is not what we're supposed to be doing. This goes against the Constitution. But John Watson Foster was being a cowboy. He was out there like, I'm not even thinking about what I've already done. I'm thinking about my next move. I'm working with these multinational corporations to secure more land and resources at highly exploitative rates because these people don't understand how the law works as we've invented it. Granddaddy John Watson Foster was a man with a peculiar destiny that spanned his own lifetime. And in absence of any real American royalty, he established his own pedigree by ensuring that his grandsons would continue on this weird imperial mission. A legacy that lived on in spirit would not suffice. John Watson Foster insisted on blood, and so he ensured the direct continuation of his precise vocation with a guarantee that only heredity provides. And so John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles go on to learn from their grandfather. He was the patriarch of the family. And as they're being raised, he has President McKinley going with Theodore Roosevelt to spend 1897 to 1909 solidifying the American imperial projects that were kicked off by Watson Foster. American troops helped liberate Cuba in 1898 following the annexation of Hawaii, and they were doing this in a great promise of freedom and democracy, that the people of Cuba deserved to live free of colonial rule from Spain. But while they were en route on a diplomatic trip, Theodore Roosevelt received a letter from Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who directed him, "Do not make peace in Cuba until the U.S. takes Puerto Rico." So this idea that the United States was ever intervening in Cuba with good intentions to free them from Spanish rule, history tells a different story. And so for these years, U.S. forces took over Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Then on the 4th of July, 1902, Mark Twain drunkenly writes this poem to summarize his feelings. His idea of a sufficient holiday parade celebrating American independence. He's sort of painting a scene with words here. Waving from a float piled high with property, the whole marked with boodle, to wit, 12,000 islands. Crowd of slaughtered patriots called rebels. Filipino Republic annihilated. Crowd of deported patriots called rebels. A crowned sultan in business with the United States and officially recognized member of the firm. Motto on the flag, to what base uses I have come at last. The pirate flag inscribed, "Oh, you'll get used to it, brother. I had sentimental scruples myself at first." William Nelson Cromwell, a lawyer and a lobbyist, helped negotiate U.S. control over the Panama Canal. This became a great project under Roosevelt's presidency. And actually, Cromwell's work helping clinch the control of the canal for the French Canal Syndicate, that's what they called themselves, got him $800,000 in payment. So Cromwell's law education, that was actually paid for by Algernon Sidney Sullivan, an Indiana lawyer, turned out to be a worthwhile investment. The two started the first international law firm for multinational corporations called Sullivan and Cromwell, based in Washington, D.C. This sort of paved in cement the trail that was blazed by John Watson Foster. Allen and Foster were steady on the path laid by their grandfather at the time of his death in 1917. The brothers became lawyers at Sullivan and Cromwell, representing their many multinational corporate clients. Upon their grandfather's passing, the new patriarch that they were looking up to was their Uncle Bert, but most people know that guy as Robert Lansing, who was the Secretary of State of the United States. It was the Woodrow Wilson presidency when the war was causing such a demand for American goods in Europe, and it was actually Robert Lansing that penned a letter insisting that the United States begin purchasing foreign bonds so that it freed up dollars in Europe so that they could purchase American goods. Really like the invention of foreign finance capital at the multinational level. He wrote, December 1st, 1914 to June 30th, 1915, our exports have exceeded our imports by nearly $1 billion. So the growing trade gap was framed in this letter as a national emergency. And it's kind of another example of the Foster Dulles Syndicate taking advantage of a wartime emergency, except this one, you could argue it was. In any case, this established the global financial infrastructure that syndicates of capital would need to expand growing markets by simply providing foreign governments with the capital necessary to purchase things from multinational corporations. That is what this move did. And it was Robert Lansing, Uncle Bert. So in 1917, after Granddaddy Dulles was dead, Uncle Bert gave the boys a lesson in how foreign policy was really made. The pro-American regime in Cuba had lost their election, and this jeopardized $3 billion in today's dollars of assets that were tied up in Cuba because of sweetheart deals that Sullivan and Cromwell had gotten with the government. So these are clients of the law firm the Dulles brothers are working at that are unhappy with the election results, and they tell Uncle Bert. And that afternoon, warships were sent to Cuba. That is how foreign policy is made in the United States. This is a well-documented event that happened in our history. And this marked the beginning of a 5-year occupation of Cuba by the United States. So in America, we're told that the reason the U.S. has hostilities towards Cuba is because of this horrible dictator named Fidel Castro, ignoring the history of just colonial and imperial rule of the United States over Cuba for many, many years. And so didn't U.S. citizens benefit from this occupation at all? Did we get cheaper goods from these multinational corporations as a result of this intervention? Or did it just assist the capital accumulation and power of this syndicate surrounding Robert Lansing and the Dulles family? So by the end of 1917, the Dulles Syndicate achieved 2 key things: the creation of global financial infrastructure and the use of the law and military force to benefit syndicates of capital at the expense of the state. So Sullivan and Cromwell, there's not a lot of records of their clients, but there are a few occasions where they've had to represent them in court and be publicly affiliated with them. So records show that both British Petroleum and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and Standard Oil were clients of Sullivan and Cromwell. In 1919, Standard Oil met with the U.S. government. And I think that's why I say this is sort of the time when syndicates of capital truly emerged. And that is because they expressed interest in Mesopotamian oil, and the U.S. government said, we're not going to intervene on behalf of a few corporations. We might intervene in another country on behalf of the benefit of the entire U.S. petroleum industry, but we're not going to intervene on just a few American corporations. And so we know this thanks to a declassified report by the Federal Trade Commission on the International Petroleum Cartel. And so the problem of wanting this oil and not having it was unresolved. Standard Oil was advised that the efforts of any single company to obtain concessions in Mesopotamia would not be supported, but that the government would act on behalf of the entire American petroleum industry. By November 1921, the International Petroleum Cartel was no longer asking. They decided to do it on their own. They simply notified the State Department that they were prepared to send a party of geologists and engineers to Mesopotamia for a reconnaissance survey. This group included the Sullivan and Cromwell client, Standard Oil, and from 1925 to 1950, the oil syndicate was really interested in Iraq, and they established the Iraq Petroleum Company with an arrangement that is just so John Watson Foster-esque. essentially, the IPC would pay the Iraqi government 400,000 pounds of gold per year until there were regular exports of crude oil, in which case there would be a royalty structure put in place, 4 shillings of gold per ton on the quantity of petroleum produced annually, with total payments not less than 400,000 gold. So once they were producing more than that, they would then, pay them their royalties. Instead, the International Petroleum Cartel, this consortium of American oil companies, created a structure so that technically the IPC was not the one making the money from the oil. So they would never reach a point where they would have to track, disclose, or share royalties with the Iraqi government. The declassified FTC report describes this agreement like this. The purpose of the royalty provision was to enable the Iraq government to obtain a higher royalty if the profits of the IPC increased, while the company would be favored by having smaller royalty payments if the profits declined. However, it was practically impossible to obtain a workable definition of terms included in the royalty provision in view of the manner in which IPC operated. As has been noted, the crude produced in Iraq was sold to the IPC groups at an arbitrary price. The crude was then refined by the respective groups, and the profits obtained from the refined products were retained by the transporting, refining, and marketing affiliates operated by the respective owners of IPC. Therefore, most of the profits from IPC's operations cannot be used as a basis for adjusting royalty payments. Moreover, IPC could not supply data on costs and prices of refined products. These could only be obtained from the records of the refining and marketing subsidiaries of the groups. So they invented a legal corporate structure that circumvented this agreement they had with the Iraqi government so that they could come in and essentially rob this country of its natural resources. Think of the poor, international, multinational corporate lawyers doing all this paperwork and negotiating. Wouldn't it just be easier if they could go in and coup the government that wouldn't work with them on something like this? The development of the deep state provided syndicates of capital with this access, and this happened in 1947. The CIA was established with the signing of the National Security Act. This was under President Truman. And the CIA essentially replaced the 5-year-old Office of Strategic Services, OSS. This was a non-departmental federal agency. It was a civilian intelligence agency meant to support the U.S. during World War II, the Allied forces. Then came Eisenhower, and he decided that a man named Allen Dulles should become the director of the CIA from 1953, and he would stay until 59. And that his brother would make a really great Secretary of State. The syndicate's first target was removing the first democratically elected leader of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. This was directly after he nationalized the country's oil and jeopardized the profits of British petroleum and instead established a nationalized oil industry for the country. And Iranians celebrated this. They went to the oil refineries and they were just cheering in the streets. The CIA proceeded by labeling this action communist and said that it was a direct threat to American interests. So we're playing the same playbook. And the CIA decided to back the Shah to come to power. And so in 1954, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company rebranded to British Petroleum. That's how we know the company today. And from the outside, it might seem like this is classic imperialism, right? This is just a government intervening in a foreign country abroad to get more resources, to make themselves more powerful. But it was not done on behalf of or by the British state. It was done on behalf of many oil companies. So this is not that. This is a newly created agency within the United States of men that have spent their lives defending the interests of and making money off of US-based multinational corporations, now deciding that the oil of a foreign country was going to be owned and operated by a consortium of companies in the UK and the United States. This was not done for the benefit of the US government. This was not done for the benefit of the people in the US or Britain. This was done on behalf of corporations and a small group of wealthy individuals. Not only this, but the analysts that were working at the CIA recommended against the coup, and that was ignored by the head of the CIA, which would be our boy, Allen Dulles, and the president. They went through with the coup against the analysts' recommendations. So this isn't even like, a bureaucratic agency gone rogue. This really is a small group of really rich individuals wielding the power of, the highest technology in the U.S. military for their own personal gain. The group of people and sort of the brain trust that made sure this happened were the British, John Watson Foster, Eisenhower, Allen Dulles, and Kermit Roosevelt, who is the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. So first it's oil, then it's bananas. I really think the coup that happened the year after is worth talking about as well. These guys decided that because the Guatemalan government was sort of reneging their long-standing agreement that a previous president had with Sullivan and Cromwell clients, that they should sort of test this playbook that had been successful in Iran. United Fruit Company, which is known today as Chiquita Banana, had a 99-year lease on the land in Guatemala. They owned a lot of the arable land. They didn't use all of it. They had this sort of sweetheart tax agreement where they were not paying what the land was valued at, and they were exploiting the labor in Guatemala that was pretty cheap. And Jorge Obico is the man that gave them this sweetheart deal. I'm sure it was negotiated by lawyers of Sullivan and Cromwell, not sure if it was the Dulles brothers themselves. But he was deposed during the Democratic Spring in Guatemala in a coup, an uprising for democracy that only cost a few hundred lives. So, change came. A school teacher named Juan Jose Arevalo was elected president. That was on March 5th, 1945. And he ran on this platform of sort of taking the government back for the people. He established strong social systems like Social Security. Because he was a teacher, he fought for more worker and legal protections coming from a union mentality. And it was a really productive 6 years. But each of these measures, like creating a tax on large landowners, as Stephen Kinzer put it, was a challenge to United Fruit. When Arevalo's term ended, a man named Jacobo Arbenz was elected, and he wasn't a communist, despite a lot of history books saying he was. The transfer of power was peaceful, and it marked democracy working in Guatemala, and he enjoyed coming into office on the heels of Arevalo's pretty poignant farewell address. And this really shows that observing the rise of syndicates of capital is not revisionist history in any way. Here's what Arevalo said. He was pretty aware of what was going on. The banana magnates, co-nationals of Roosevelt, rebelled against the audacity of a Central American president who gave his fellow citizens a legal equality with the honorable families of exporters. It was then that the school teacher, ingenuous and romantic, from the presidency of his country, discovered how perishable, frail, and slippery the brilliant international doctrines of democracy and freedom were. It was then, with the deepest despondency and pain that I felt, with consequent indignation, the pressure of that anonymous force that rules, without laws or morals, international relations, and the relationships of men. Elected the same year as Mossadegh, Arbenz then got to work, and he promised to convert our country from a dependent nation with a semi-colonial economy into an economically independent country, to convert Guatemala from a country bound by a predominantly feudal economy into a modern capitalist state, and to make this transformation in a way that will raise the standard of living of the great mass of people to the highest level. So he was clever to promise capitalism, as a lot of the enemies of American multinational corporations were slandered as communists. So he decides to pass the Agrarian Reform Law. And this meant that United Fruit, which owned 550,000 acres but only used 15% of the land, that they would then have 234,000 of those acres seized by the government because they were not using the land. And the government offered United Fruit $1.185 million in compensation. And Arbenz, what a guy. He used the most recent tax documents of United Fruits in order to determine the value of the land. And they said, this is not what the land is worth. And they were like, well, that is what your tax documents say. And of course, they had this agreement with Ubico that that's what they would be paying. But it was a severe devaluation of the land. They were told that actually the land was worth $19 million. So it was devalued 16-fold. And so the Dulles brothers, decided to scrap for their buddies at Sullivan and Cromwell. And they prepared for a much larger scale coup this time. December 3rd, 1953, they devoted $3 million to the coup. They called the operation PBSUCCESS at the CIA. And declassified documents show that they were actually considering assassination, and they went through a few different ideas for how to do it, and then they instead landed on a junta coup, that they would make it seem like there was an organic uprising in Guatemala against this communist leader. It was a really great display of political theater. It was almost like the Dulles brothers met up after the coup in Iran, and they said, okay, now let's do a silly one. My camera died, so we're going to finish this on here. Here's how silly it got. They ran a revolutionary radio broadcast out of Miami, pretending to be in Guatemala. They painted CIA planes to look like military insurgent planes. They went really hard. They had an hour-by-hour update on how their insurgency was going, the Dulles brothers, in D.C., on their manufactured uprising against Arbenz. Arbenz knew what was going on from the beginning. He actually wrote, his foreign minister wrote to the United Nations Security Council asking them to condemn the aggression in the country at the instigation of certain foreign monopolies. The president addressed Guatemala at the government radio station, and he said, "Our crime is having enacted an agrarian reform which affected the interests of the United Fruit Company. Our crime is wanting to have our own route to the Atlantic, our own electric power, and our own docks and ports. Our crime is our patriotic wish to advance, to progress, and to win economic independence that would match our political independence. It is completely untrue that communists are taking over our government. We have imposed no terror. It is, on the contrary, the Guatemalan friends of Mr. Foster Dulles who wish to spread terror among our people, attacking women and children by surprise with impunity from pirate airplanes." So the Dosterfallis Syndicate had the hand-picked successor that they wanted to take over from Arbenz. His name was Castillo Armas. Everything's dying. Let's keep going. Who cares? For 15 days, a cruel war against Guatemala has been underway. The United Fruit Company, in collaboration with the governing circles of the United States, is responsible for what is happening to us. I've not violated my faith in democratic liberties, in the independence of Guatemala, and in all the good that is the future of humanity. I've always said to you that we would fight, regardless of the cost. But the cost should not include the destruction of our country and sending our riches abroad. And this could happen if we do not eliminate the pretext that our powerful enemy has raised. A government different from mine, but always inspired by our October Revolution, is preferred to the 20 years of fascist bloody tyranny under the rule of the bands that Castillo Armas has brought to the country. So Colonel Diaz then accepted the presidency, and the CIA was not happy with that. They did not want someone who was friendly at all to the previous administration to have power. He was then replaced with Colonel Efegio Monzon, who would then usher in Castillo Armas's presidency. The junta collaborators in Guatemala were paid $100,000 each by the CIA. They got fancy diplomatic posts in the new administration. The decision to pledge their loyalty to the Dulles Syndicate paid off, I guess. And so then we had the Eisenhower administration. Secretary John Foster Dulles framed the situation as a win for freedom and democracy over communist imperialism. This is what he said. The Guatemalan government and communist agents throughout the world have persistently attempted to obscure the real issue, that of communist imperialism, by claiming that the U.S. was only interested in protecting American business. We regret that there have been disputes between the Guatemalan government and the United Fruit Company, but this issue is relatively unimportant. Thus, the situation is being cured by the Guatemalans themselves. This is what they said, with declassified documents now showing they were spending $3 million to get rid of this presidency. And so, what a crazy time in our history. I think this shows a few important things. That syndicates of capital really established their power by creating these non-departmental governmental agencies where they did have military force, military power that could be wielded to achieve their interests. All they needed was a president that was willing to appoint them. And even then it wasn't that necessary, because this machine operates in a manner where people will say, hey, this guy is really good for this post, and this multinational company will give you a huge campaign donation if you promise to put our boy, Foster Dulles, in office as Secretary of State. That's how lobbying and money has affected our government. And we could call it exploitation, or we could call it corruption, but it is legal, right? And that's the crisis at the heart of this whole story, is we conflate law and justice too frequently. We think that, oh, well, it's perfectly above board and legal for these businesses to give a bunch of money to elected officials. And then it turns out the person that they prefer in this specific post in office is placed there. It's like buying for a position in government, which feels undemocratic, but yeah, it's perfectly legal. But is it just? Is it fair? Is that how society should run? And syndicates of capital have operated in a manner where they take advantage of wherever the law fails or the law cannot be enforced on behalf of the people. And it exposes the weakness of the state altogether. And so the Dulles family syndicate establishing themselves and wielding their power was really the moment where they had control over global financial institutions, and actually global financial infrastructure itself was necessary for the expansion of syndicates of capital to operate across borders. And the establishment of the CIA was essential so that they could use the state kind of like a puppet. And the moment that the owners and the people controlling multinational corporations were able to say, you know what, we're no longer asking the U.S. government what we can do abroad. We're going to do this ourselves. And we might wield violent force, which was typically only reserved for the state. When the International Petroleum Cartel reached the point where they said, we're no longer asking, we're just going to do this, and then we're going to get people in government to do this with us, that, I think, was the fall of the anarchy of states. States did not have more power than small groups of very wealthy individuals working together. So that's why we identify the growth of syndicates of capital as something that's happened over the last 20 years. And why I think the Dulles family is just the most fascinating and important family to pay attention to really understand how syndicates of capital formed. Of course, there's other really rich and powerful families you could look to, but I hope this has made clear as to why I'm so obsessed with the Dulles family. You can read the essay in full on my Substack, and you can subscribe there so you never miss anything from this series. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you learned something new. Love you, bye.